When Anne said, "You would be happier back in England under that papist Queen of Charles," she was talking about Henrietta. Henrietta was not a popular figure in England, so to say that Puritans would be happier under her than in the Bay was saying a lot. Puritans in Parliament distrusted her because she was Catholic, the daughter of the King of France. As part of the marriage agreement between her and Charles, she was allowed to practice her religion in England freely and brought many priests and monks into her entourage. She gained the reputation as an evil papist, seducing her husband away from Protestantism and towards Rome, but she did not. Charles lived and died a Protestant, but that didn't stop the rumors. As Charles' royal policy seemed more and more popish and absolutist, fears abounded of a popish plot to subvert England's religious laws, directed by Henrietta. She was deeply loyal to her husband and took his stand against Parliament. At the beginning of the Civil War, she went to France to seek foreign aid for Charles and never saw him after that. All right, let's talk about this. Are Puritans the same as Pilgrims? No, yes and no, but mostly no. In the beginning, while they were in England, they were not the same. In the end, though, when the Puritans and Pilgrims had lived together in the New World, there was very little difference in the way they worshipped.
What was the difference in the beginning? I'm sorry.
I'll tell you right now. This slide will show you. Puritans, are they the same as Pilgrims? Now, back in England, they were not the same. On this scale, you can see that the Pilgrims, as we now call them, were the most radical of all the dissenters on the far left-hand side of the scale. In their day, they were known as separatists, a dirty word, because they wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. They believed the Church of England was a false church because it allowed believers and non-believers alike to be members. Instead, the separatists covenanted only with believers. They elected their own ministers and threw away the Book of Common Prayer, replacing it with sermons and psalm singing. Their dissent was a crime of treason, since they refused to worship the way Queen Elizabeth prescribed every Englishman should worship back in 1559. Many separatists were hanged or imprisoned for their beliefs. The Puritans who came to Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 1630s were more middle of the road, as you can see in the middle there. They knew the consequences of separating from their dear Mother Church and made a point to say that they were still members. Their ministers were still ordained in the Church of England, and they abided by the accepted form of worship with a little bit of their own thrown in. They took loyalty oaths to the king and the church before they even got on board their ships. They even criticized the separatists for going too far and believed that by staying in the Church of England, they could accomplish more good than by leaving it. Because of persecution, a small group of separatists from Scrooby, England, immigrated to Holland in 1609, and from there to what became Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. It's important to remember their other name was Brownists, because that name will come up later on. They were nicknamed Brownists after their minister, of course, John Brown. Brownist was a code word for separatist, and everybody back then knew it. Today, they're known as Pilgrims, a much more romantic name, because their descendants and everyone on down the line have called them that. Here's a depiction of their departure from Holland to the New World in 1620. The Massachusetts Bay Company was founded by Puritans, not by Pilgrims. How did it get started? Believe it or not, this man was a Puritan. Whoop. No. Well, yes, he was, but believe it or not, this man was a Puritan. This is Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick. He was a great friend to the Puritans, hiding them from Laud's men and giving them money when they needed it. He was a pirate and an empire builder, and because of his wealth, a member of the House of Lords. Here was an odd combination, a Puritan and a pirate. Queen Elizabeth turned a blind eye to English merchant vessels plundering Spanish vessels during the war with Spain. People said of him, a man of less virtue could not be found out, but he got the style of a godly man. Warwick was a member of the Council for New England, a monopoly that granted patents to trading companies. What he did in 1628 was to go behind the back of Sir Ferdinando Gorges, another council member, and appropriate lands already granted to him to the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Company instead. When Gorges was away, the Puritans even got a royal charter from the king himself to seal the deal. Needless to say, Gorges was piping mad and spent the rest of his life trying to get Massachusetts back for himself, using his influence with the king and Laud. The 127 London merchants and Puritans who founded the Massachusetts Bay Company were shrewd businessmen who wanted the colony to succeed, and so they sent an advance party to resettle the old outpost of Naumkeag, today called Salem, with some 200 families, servants, and 2 ministers to prepare the way for the Arbella and her fleet the next year. The acting governor of this advance party was John Endicott. Very early on, troubles brewed as to the form the Sunday worship service would take. Some of the old planters and some of the new, including 2 brothers by the name of Samuel and John Brown, not the same John Brown of the Pilgrims. These 2 brothers wanted the traditional English service from the Book of Common Prayer, but that was not to be. Endicott and the 2 ministers decided that the way they worshipped in Plymouth, the separatist way, with psalm singing and sermons, was the way they would do it in Naumkeag. He forbid the Book of Common Prayer, and he also sent the Messrs. Brown back to England as troublemakers. Since they had put a lot of money into the Bay Company already, the brothers wanted redress for their losses. They petitioned the officers of the Massachusetts Bay Company back in London to hear their case. Interestingly enough, they chose William Vassall and 3 others to hear their case. Representing the company's interests and the side of John Endicott were John Winthrop and 3 others. At a meeting on September 29th, 1629, a meeting William Vassall did not attend, the private letters of the 2 brothers were discussed, and it was decided that none of the letters from Mr. Sam Brown shall be delivered, but kept to be made use of against him as occasion shall be offered. Our leaders did that. The leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Company wanted no negative press about their new colony that they were about to launch the next year with the sailing of a fleet of ships carrying 700 passengers to Salem. They especially didn't want the king thinking that Massachusetts was a haven for separatists. I'm sorry for this faded slide, but this is the only one I've got. This is a reproduction of the Arbella, now long decayed, that was built in 1930 for the 300th anniversary of the Puritans' arrival in Massachusetts. It once stood in the harbor of the Pioneer Village in Salem, a mock village simulating the early settlement under Endicott. After several decades of oblivion and vandalism, the Pioneer Village is now again open for historical reenactments and tours. On April 7th, 1630, the date of departure of the Arbella, John Humphrey, the deputy governor of the company, decided at the last minute not to go on the voyage. Was he also uneasy over the decidedly separatist nature the company was taking upon itself? Humphrey's absence cleared the way for Thomas Dudley to rise to the position of deputy governor under Winthrop. So, now the governing power of the Massachusetts Bay Company was in the hands of 2 men, Winthrop and Dudley, who had taken the side of John Endicott. The seeds of intolerance were being planted. William Vassall sailed to New England with his family on April 7, 1630, perhaps on the Arbella itself, arriving on June 12th in Salem, and then left with them to return to England in early August, after a stay of only 6 weeks. We know this because Thomas Dudley mentions the Vassal family as among the 100 people returning on the Lion in a letter he wrote to Lady Bridget, the Countess of Lincoln, in March of 1631. Now, this got me very surprised. Why would a loving father subject his family to a dangerous ocean voyage only to turn around 6 weeks later and do the same thing? It doesn't make sense unless he had every intention of staying in New England and something happened either during the ocean voyage or after they arrived in Salem that so soured him of the experiment that he decided he was not going to let his family stay there and left. Was it the disease, the starvation, and dilapidated village they found at Salem? Or was it something else? Deputy Governor Dudley wrote to Lady Bridget that 100 people left on the Lion, partly out of dislike of our government, which restrained and punished their excesses, and partly through fear of famine. And glad were we so to be rid of them. Was he including the vassals in that statement? He goes on to say, others also, afterwards hearing of men of their own disposition, which were planted at Piscataway, went from us to them, whereby though our numbers were lessened, yet we accounted ourselves nothing weakened by their removal. Piscataway, the settlement at the mouth of the Piscataqua River, now Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was colonized by a patent received by our old hoodwinked friend Ferdinando Gorges in the early 1620s. According to a book on Portsmouth history written in 1915 by Charles Hazlitt, the settlers of Portsmouth were supporters of the Church of England and therefore bitterly denounced by the Massachusetts colony. In spite of the assertions which have been handed down generation after generation and repeated without examination and without reflection that this was merely a business settlement, a worldly and ungodly colony, while the saints were all at the bay, it is easy to show that the purpose of the founders was to make this a branch of the established Church of England, and that this runs through all the charters. So we have it on Deputy Governor Dudley's account that some of the settlers in the Winthrop fleet went back to England on the Lion, and others migrated to New Hampshire to be among men of their own disposition, members of the Church of England, or Anglicans as we call them now, because they realized the separatist nature of the new colony, or at least its antipathy to outward expressions of Anglican worship. Another faded slide. We colonials are fond of those. Let us jump 4 months later. It is now December of 1630. The terrible summer of starvation has already passed. Vassal has made it back to England. John Humphrey, the original deputy governor who backed out of the voyage at the last minute, is still back in England. He writes a letter to John Winthrop in Boston, in which he says that the good people in London are convinced that the Massachusetts Bay Company's purpose is separatist, and asks Winthrop to alleviate their fears and restore their former good opinion of the company. Now, how were the good people of London privy to news from Massachusetts in such a short time? I think if Vassal left Salem in August, he probably made it back to England by mid to late October, plenty of time in which to spread the word around London of the separatist nature of the colony. Vassal, either alone or with some of the passengers from the Lion, was responsible then for painting the colony as separatist, thereby giving it a bad reputation in England. No wonder Winthrop said he was always opposed to the civil government of this country in the way of our churches, always from the very beginning. The Lion returned to Massachusetts on February 5th, 1631, and with it 26 passengers and letters from friends back home. Dudley is sorrowed by what they have to say and continues his ongoing letter to Lady Bridget, saying, They who went discontentedly from us the last year, mainly Vassal, out of their evil affections towards us, have raised many false and scandalous reports against us, affirming us to be Brownists, ding ding, separatists in religion, and ill-affected to our state at home, and that these vile reports have won credit with some who formerly wished us well. Might those people who were convinced of the reports be the same good people of London Humphrey was talking about? I think so. I think that's a pretty good indication that Vassal himself was the bearer of such news, and I wonder what happened in the first few weeks after he and his family arrived to raise an alarm in his mind about their government and their curbing of people's excesses. All this sets the stage for Vassal's involvement in later colonial movements of dissent. All interesting and lengthy stories in themselves that you can find on Google: the Hobart affair of Hingham, the dissolution of his church in Scituate and its ensuing theological controversies, the Robert Child petition he secreted to England, and his petition to the Plymouth General Court for religious tolerance in 1645. All ended in abysmal failure, resulting in his final departure from New England for good onto greener pastures in the Barbados in 1646. I'd like to close with the words from Vassal's petition to the General Court in Plymouth Colony in the summer of 1645. The petition would allow and maintain full and free tolerance of religion to all men that would preserve the civil peace and submit unto government. And there's to be no limitation or exception against Turk, Muslim, Jew, Papist, read Catholic, Arian, those who denied Christ's divinity, Socinian, code word for Unitarians, Nicolaitan, I don't know what a Nicolaitan is, but Vassal did, Familist, or any other. Such an extraordinary broad advocacy of religious liberty and the recognition that the civil and the religious should be separate would not be heard of again until the writing of the U.S. Constitution. The end.
Folks, from PuritanTour.com, Linda Palmer. One more round of applause, Linda Palmer. All right, we're rounding the clubhouse turn. We're in the final home stretch here of the second annual New England History Festival. There will be a third annual, as I mentioned. Mark your calendars because I desperately need each and every one of you to come next year on November 14th, 2009. Some special people. First of all, I had the pleasure about a couple of weeks ago in late October, the 24th, I believe, or 23rd, speaking in Boston for the Massachusetts Society of the Order of the Founders and Patriots of America. So I'd like to represent two friends of mine, Deputy Governor Henry Peach and Executive Secretary Deborah Nowers. Deborah. Great organization. I guess I was going to give him some ink, and I guess he's just, oh, there you are, Tim. Tim Murley, www.timmurley.com. I've invited him next year. He does commissions, exhibitions, children's books, but he specializes in colonial art. So, Tim, say hello. Good. All right. And again, folks, we invite you to log on to the website, www.historyfestival.org.